Welcome back to Cowboy Steelheart. Gather around the fire, friends. Tonight's tale is about a cold that settles deep in your bones, coming not just from the mountain wind, but from the cruelty of folks who ought to know better. It is a story of a fragile widow, her only loyal companion, and the silent giant who refused to let her face the dark alone. The Wyoming wind howled through town, whipping snow against frosted windows. Evelyn stood on the boardwalk, her heavy, trembling frame wrapped in a threadbare black shawl. Tears froze on her flushed cheeks as she begged the men for help. Her little terrier, the only living thing that loved her, had bolted toward the jagged canyons. The townsfolk merely sneered. One man mocked her, telling the heavy widow she had enough meat on her bones to survive without a useless mutt. Evelyn sobbed, her gentle heart shattering under their cruel laughter. Then the laughter died entirely. The saloon doors swung open, and the towering, massive frame of Callahan filled the doorway. The giant cowboy stepped down, the boardwalk groaning under his sheer weight. He ignored the cowards completely. He stopped right in front of Evelyn, looking down at her tear-streaked face. Pulling up his thick duster collar against the biting frost, his deep, rumbling voice cut straight through the howling wind. "Mot Leglung, find him. Before we journey into those freezing canyons, if you find comfort in tales of rugged protectors and gentle hearts discovering their true worth, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep the campfire burning brightly, and we sure appreciate you sitting with us. Now, let us go back to that howling Wyoming wind." The silence that fell over the snow-swept boardwalk was absolute and heavy. You could hear the tiny, sharp flakes of ice ticking violently against the wooden posts. But not a single man standing on that porch dared to breathe too loudly. Callahan stood there, an immovable mountain, wrapped in a dark, heavy canvas duster, his impossibly broad shoulders practically blocking out the dim yellow light spilling from the saloon windows behind him. Evelyn just stared up at him, her large, sorrowful brown eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and a desperate, fragile hope she had not felt in years. She clutched her threadbare black shawl tighter around her heavy, shivering frame. No one had ever stepped in for her. Ever since her husband passed, the town had made a vicious sport of looking right through her, or worse, looking at her soft, curvy figure with sneering contempt. They saw her size as a burden, a joke, in a harsh, unforgiving land that demanded lean, calloused endurance. But Callahan did not look at her like she was a burden. He looked at her like she was a woman who had lost her entire world, and he silently refused to let her lose 1 ounce more. He slowly reached out, his massive leather-gloved hand hovering just for a second, before he gently, almost reverently, brushed a dusting of snow from her trembling shoulder. "Go inside the mercantile," he rumbled, his voice lower than the thunder rolling over the jagged peaks. Yet it carried an undeniable, bone-rattling command that made the cowardly men on the porch shuffle backward in sudden fear. "Wait by the stove. Mort will not come back empty-handed." Evelyn sobbed, a raw, ragged sound tearing from her throat as she tried to form words of desperate gratitude. But her teeth were chattering too violently from the cold and the shock. She wanted to follow him, to march into the biting frost to search for her little terrier Barnaby. But the sheer, imposing authority, radiating from the giant cowboy, anchored her feet entirely to the frosted boards. Callahan turned his back on the town, not even gracing the sneering drunks with a passing glance. His silence was profoundly dismissive, an absolute statement that those cruel men were utterly beneath his notice. He waded through the knee-deep snow toward the livery, his massive strides eating up the distance in seconds, completely ignoring the screaming wind. He swung a heavy, winterized saddle onto his massive black draft cross, a terrifying beast of a horse nearly as intimidating as the man himself. Evelyn watched through the blinding white flurries as the towering mountain man rode out toward the jagged throat of the canyon, disappearing entirely into the swirling abyss of the winter storm. The moment his massive silhouette vanished into the whiteout, the suffocating, heavy presence of the town's judgment crept right back over her, wrapping around her throat like a physical hand. Evelyn pushed open the heavy wooden door of the mercantile, the brass bell jingling weakly against the violent gale outside. The intense heat of the cast-iron pot-belly stove hit her frozen skin, making her extremities throb with a dull ache. But the physical warmth did absolutely nothing to thaw the icy, piercing stares of the storekeeper and the two local women, browsing the fabric bolts near the back. The storekeeper, a lean, bitter man with sharp, rat-like eyes, aggressively sorted a wooden box of heavy iron nails, his movements loud and deliberately intimidating. "It is a completely fool's errand," he muttered loudly, casting a sideways, openly mocking glance at Evelyn's heavy, trembling figure as she stood dripping snow onto his clean floorboards. "That useless mutt is wolf bait by now, and sending a wealthy rancher like Callahan out into a death blizzard for a creature that cannot even pull a cart is plain, undeniable selfishness." Evelyn flinched visibly, her soft cheeks burning with a hot, agonizing shame beneath the lingering chill of the storm. She shrank deeply into herself, pulling her heavy woolen shawl tighter, desperately trying to make her large, noticeable frame as small as humanly possible. She was so terribly, painfully used to this treatment. They looked at her round, soft face and her full, heavy figure and saw only weakness, a drain on their resources. They did not see the countless, terrifying nights she had survived completely alone in her freezing, drafty cabin, strictly rationing a single sack of flour for months, desperately trying to keep the memory of her late husband alive. Barnaby was not just a dog to her. That little scruffy terrier was the very last heartbeat of her old, happy life. When her husband succumbed to the winter fever 2 brutal years ago, the local bank had swooped in Tehat, breathless, terrifying cruelty, taking the farm, seizing the cattle, and leaving her entirely destitute, Tehat, nothing but the modest clothes on her back and the tiny, shivering pup her husband had gifted her on their last anniversary. Barnaby was the absolute only soul in this godforsaken, frozen territory who looked at Evelyn and saw total perfection. When the bitter townswoman whispered viciously at Sehat Uro Sehat about her, stretching the seams of her mourning dresses, loudly suggesting she ate more than her fair share of charity rations, Barnaby would rest his warm, rough chin on her heavy knee, his eyes full of pure adoration. When she cried herself to sleep in the dark, her heavy body racked with the absolute physical agony of total isolation, Barnaby would crawl under the thin blankets and curl tightly against her spine, becoming a tiny, vital furnace of unconditional devotion. Losing him out there in the freezing canyon meant violently severing the final, fraying thread, tethering her to sanity. She sat rigidly on a hard wooden cracker barrel near the radiating stove, her knuckles turning stark white, praying silently to a sky she could not see through the frosted glass. The women near the counter exchanged cruel, condescending smiles, whispering entirely loud enough for her to hear about how a woman of her significant, heavy size ought to be grateful she had extra padding to keep warm, rather than sitting around crying over a lost, useless mongrel. Evelyn squeezed her eyes tightly shut, her chest heaving, absolutely refusing to let them see her break, desperately holding on to the deep, rumbling memory of Callahan's promise. Miles away from the suffocating judgment of the mercantile, the reality of the canyon was a brutal, frozen, blinding nightmare. Callahan rode his massive draft horse deep into the jagged, rocky corridor, the wind screaming through the narrow stone walls like a massive chorus of dying men. The snow was falling in thick, blinding, horizontal sheets, rapidly burying any trace of tracks and turning the landscape into a disorienting void of white. Most men would have turned back instantly. Most men would have considered a tiny, fragile dog a completely lost cause in the face of a true, deadly Wyoming blizzard. But Callahan was absolutely not most men. He was a creature born of the high mountains, a silent giant who had single-handedly carved his incredibly wealthy cattle ranch out of the harshest granite and ice this territory had to offer. His immense, muscular frame easily absorbed the punishing, bitter cold, his square jaw set in a grim, entirely immovable line. He swung down from the heavy saddle, his heavy leather boots crunching violently into the deep, waist-high drifts. He intimately knew this deadly canyon. He knew the treacherous, hidden drop-offs, the deep crevices concealed by snow, and the massive snow pits that could instantly swallow a grown man whole, let alone a terrified little terrier. He securely tied his horse to a stunted, frozen pine tree, trusting the massive, loyal beast to wait, and began to track purely on foot. He dropped heavily to one knee, gently brushing away the fresh, powdery snow with his massive, leather-clad hand, There, barely visible against the frozen, unforgiving earth, was a tiny, frantic paw print, rapidly filling with new snow. Callahan's stoic, piercing gray eyes narrowed against the biting, violent wind. As he stared at the fragile track, his mind drifted entirely to the woman waiting back in that hostile mercantile. He had watched Evelyn for many long months from the quiet, shadowed corners of the town. He had seen the horrific, daily way the town treated her, openly mocking her soft, curvy frame, discarding her entirely because she did not fit their rigid, skeletal mold of frontier survival. But Callahan had seen something else entirely. He saw the quiet, immense grace in the way she moved, the gentle, heartbreaking kindness she offered to the stray horses tied at the livery. The profound, staggering resilience it took for her to simply walk down the muddy street, her head held high, while the entire world actively tried to crush her spirit. To his watchful eyes, her full, heavy figure was absolutely not a flaw. It was a beautiful testament to her warmth, a striking, magnificent contrast to the bitter, hollow, emaciated people who surrounded her. He had never spoken a single word to her before today, choosing instead to remain a silent, deeply protective shadow, positioning his massive frame to ensure no drunken ranch hand ever dared to bump into her on the boardwalk. But when he saw her weeping uncontrollably on the boards today, entirely broken by the agonizing loss of her dog, the quiet, protective beast living inside him had roared violently to life. He would absolutely not let her suffer. He pushed much deeper into the dark gorge, the freezing snow now reaching aggressively halfway up his thick, muscular thighs. The temperature was plunging rapidly, becoming the kind of deep, numbing, terrifying cold that cracked thick tree bark and instantly froze the breath inside your lungs. He carefully navigated an incredibly treacherous, slick, icy incline, his massive hands gripping the jagged, freezing rocks for vital purchase. The wind actively fought him, slamming into his broad chest, trying desperately to push his towering, heavy frame off the narrow ledge, but his sheer, terrifying physical strength anchored him flawlessly to the mountain. He paused for a fraction of a second, his sharp, practiced ears straining desperately against the deafening roar of the gale. A sound. It was so incredibly faint, it could have easily been the wind whistling sharply through a hollow, dead log. But Callahan instantly recognized the high-pitched, desperate, agonizing whimper of a terrified, dying animal. He hauled his massive, heavy body over the slick, icy ridge, his intense eyes scanning the treacherous, dark ravine below. The canyon walls here were incredibly steep and coated thick with black ice, dropping straight down into a massive, tangled mess of dead, frozen brush and fallen timber. He squinted hard through the blinding, swirling white flurries, his heart beating a slow, incredibly steady rhythm against his ribs, as he pinpointed the source of the tiny, heartbreaking sound. There, trapped helplessly beneath the heavy, snow-laden, crushing branches of a massive fallen cedar tree, was a tiny, shivering, pathetic lump of matted fur. Barnaby was hopelessly tangled in a dense nest of sharp, unforgiving brambles, his small, fragile paws bleeding profusely, his tiny body trembling so violently that the surrounding snow was vibrating. The freezing numbness was rapidly beginning to overtake him, his movements sluggish and weak. The terrier let out another weak, entirely pathetic cry, his dark eyes rolling back in sheer exhaustion as the cold slowly stopped his heart. Callahan did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He slid directly down the treacherous, vertical icy bank, his heavy, steel-toed boots carving deep, violent gouges into the frozen earth to control his massive, plunging descent. The sharp thorns of the dead cedar bush tore violently at his heavy canvas duster and aggressively scraped across his rugged, bearded jaw, drawing beads of crimson blood, but he felt absolutely nothing. His only focus, his singular mission, was the tiny, fading life trapped in the snow. He reached the trapped animal, moving his giant frame with a slowness and absolute gentleness that completely defied his terrifying, massive size. He quickly stripped off his heavy, warm leather gloves, fully exposing his bare, heavily calloused hands to the biting, agonizing frost, needing to be, absolutely, perfectly certain he did not accidentally crush the fragile creature in his haste. "Easy now, little warrior," Callahan whispered into the storm, his deep, incredibly resonant voice cutting straight through the violent wind like a warm, comforting hearth. He carefully, and methodically snapped the thick, freezing brambles with his bare, powerful fingers, dismantling the deadly wooden cage piece by piece. Barnaby bared his tiny, sharp teeth, utterly terrified of the massive giant looming over him, entirely ready to fight to his last breath. But the very moment Callahan's massive, impossibly warm bare hand gently cupped the dog, shivering, freezing body, the terrier instantly went entirely limp, instinctively sensing the profound, unyielding safety in the giant's careful touch. Callahan carefully scooped the freezing dog up from the snow, holding him tightly against his incredibly broad, muscular chest. He quickly unbuttoned the top of his heavy canvas duster and ripped open his thick woolen shirt, directly and deliberately exposing his bare, hot skin to the brutal, cutting wind. He tucked the freezing, wet terrier deep inside his layers, placing the tiny animal right against his immense, steadily beating heart. He immediately secured his heavy coat tightly back up, completely trapping the fragile dog in a perfectly sealed cocoon of vital, life-saving body heat. Barnaby let out a long, shuddering, wet sigh and weakly pressed his icy, wet nose directly against the giant's incredibly warm, solid chest, his violent trembling slowly beginning to subside. Callahan buttoned his duster all the way up to his thick neck, his strong jaw clenching tightly as the violent wind whipped his dark, snow-filled hair wildly around his face. Now came the absolute hardest part of the journey. He had to somehow climb back up the slick, completely vertical icy ravine using only one free hand, carefully carrying a precious, incredibly fragile cargo against his chest, while the absolute deadliest, most blinding storm of the decade fully descended upon the Wyoming territory. Back in the suffocating warmth of the town mercantile, the agonizing hours dragged on like a slow, painful death. The dim light outside the heavily frosted windows rapidly faded from a dull, depressing gray to a terrifying, pitch-black endless void. The howling, demonic wind violently shook the very foundations of the wooden building, rattling the tin cups on the shelves and causing the hanging lanterns to swing wildly, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Evelyn sat entirely frozen on her hard barrel, her wide, absolutely terrified eyes locked unblinkingly on the front door. The storekeeper was sweeping the floor, aggressively and loudly, banging the heavy wooden broom against the counter legs to deliberately shatter the silence. "He is absolutely not coming back," the storekeeper snapped viciously, stopping to lean heavily on his broom handle, glaring at the widow. "Nobody, and mote mean nobody, survives the gorge in the dark during a whiteout like this. Not even a massive, stubborn mountain of a man like Callahan. You have officially sent a very good, wealthy man to his freezing death over a useless, rat-sized dog. Mote hope you are profoundly proud of your pathetic self." Evelyn gasped violently clapping her trembling hands over her mouth, as a completely fresh wave of agonizing, soul-crushing sobs tore forcefully through her chest. The crushing, suffocating weight of the guilt he was placing on her shoulders was utterly unbearable. Was it truly true? Had her desperate, pathetic tears forcefully condemned the absolute only man who had ever shown her a single ounce of genuine mercy? She rocked back and forth on the barrel, her heavy, soft frame trembling violently, wishing with every fiber of her being that she could just disappear, wishing the wooden floorboards would magically open up and swallow her entirely whole. The cruel, gossiping women had long since hurried home to their warm, safe fires, leaving poor Evelyn completely alone with the bitter, hateful storekeeper and her own rapidly escalating terror. She stared endlessly at the thick frost covering the window glass, desperately praying for a massive, dark shadow to magically emerge from the violent blackness, while the cruel, unyielding voice of the town continuously whispered in her ear that hope was just another word for total foolishness. Friends, out here in the unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming territory, the winter cold is a living, breathing beast. It does not care if you are a hardened mountain man or a gentle, grieving widow. It simply seeks to devour anything warm. But there is a secondary cold in these frontier towns, a completely bitter, freezing cruelty that lives directly in the hearts of folks who have allowed this harsh land to strip away their fundamental humanity. We left our towering, silent protector deep in the belly of a completely pitch-black, frozen gorge, violently fighting a terrifying, blinding blizzard with a tiny, shivering terrier tucked securely against his bare, radiating chest. Let us return to that treacherous, icy ravine. Callahan dug the reinforced steel toe of his heavy leather boot directly into the sheer, black ice of the canyon wall. The freezing, demonic wind violently lashed across his incredibly broad back, attempting desperately to tear him entirely loose and send his massive frame plunging back into the frozen, tangled abyss below. He moved with agonizing, deliberate slowness, his massive left arm locked completely tight over his heavy canvas duster, fiercely protecting the fragile, trembling bulge of the terrier, entirely encased against his blazing body heat. His right hand, thick and heavily calloused, clamped aggressively onto jagged, freezing roots and sharp, unforgiving granite outcroppings, hauling his immense, muscular frame upward inch by agonizing inch. His thick, heavy muscles burned with a terrifying, absolute fire, completely defying the numbing, deadly frost aggressively settling deep into his joints. The storm screamed a deafening, terrifying chorus entirely around him, creating a blinding, violent vortex of absolute whiteout conditions that made it completely impossible to see more than a single arm's length ahead. Most men, even the most seasoned trackers in the territory, would have instantly panicked, rapidly losing their vital grip to the overwhelming, suffocating terror of the frozen dark. But Callahan was absolutely not an ordinary man. He was forged entirely by the brutal, unforgiving high country, his spirit as completely unyielding as the very mountains he owned. He methodically calculated every single agonizing pull, trusting his immense raw physical power and his absolutely unwavering, stoic determination. Beneath the heavy layers of his ice-caked duster, he felt the tiny, fragile, rapid heartbeat of the terrier thumping steadily against his warm skin. That tiny pulse was a profound, undeniable reminder of the gentle, heavily built woman waiting entirely alone in that cruel, suffocating town. The vivid image of Evelyn's soft, tear-streaked face burned brilliantly in his mind, completely obliterating the agonizing, biting cold. He deeply remembered the incredibly profound vulnerability shining in her large, sorrowful brown eyes. The beautiful, heavy curves of her body, shivering violently under that incredibly threadbare, pathetic shawl. The vicious, hollow people of the town looked at her soft, full figure and arrogantly saw a burden, a completely useless drain on their scarce winter resources. But Callahan saw a breathtaking, resilient survivor, a gentlewoman of profound, immense worth, who absolutely desperately needed someone to simply stand up for her when the entire world had forcefully turned its back. He clamped his bare, freezing right hand completely onto the frozen edge of the upper canyon ridge, his thick, powerful fingers digging violently into the hardened, icy earth. With one final terrifying surge of absolute, raw physical strength, he violently hauled his towering, incredibly massive body entirely over the treacherous lip of the gorge, collapsing heavily into the deep, waist-high, powdery snow. He lay there perfectly still for just a single, ragged heartbeat, his incredibly broad chest heaving violently, carefully shielding the tiny terrier completely beneath his immense, protective bulk, refusing to let the deadly wind steal a single ounce of the dog's returning warmth. The howling blizzard had completely erased all traces of the trail, aggressively transforming the jagged canyon entrance into a disorienting, terrifying wasteland of shifting, mountainous snowdrifts. Callahan slowly pushed his massive, towering frame completely upright, utterly ignoring the agonizing, burning sting of the frostbite, aggressively attacking his exposed, bare fingers. He quickly yanked his heavy, winter leather gloves back onto his freezing hands, his stoic, piercing gray eyes narrowing sharply against the blinding, horizontal sheets of driving ice. He waded forcefully through the treacherous, waist-deep powder, his heavy, steel-toed boots violently kicking a clear path directly toward the stunted, frozen pine tree, where he had securely tied his loyal mount. The massive black draft cross was stamping his enormous, heavy hooves anxiously into the snow, his thick winter coat entirely caked in a heavy, solid layer of freezing white ice. Callahan murmured low, deeply soothing tones to the frightened, magnificent beast, his remarkably deep, rumbling voice easily cutting straight through the shrieking, violent gale. He heavily swung his towering, muscular frame entirely into the winterized saddle, carefully and methodically adjusting his thick canvas duster to ensure the tiny, fragile dog remained perfectly, securely enclosed against his chest. The massive horse surged powerfully forward, aggressively breaking completely through the terrifying, chest-high snowdrifts. With sheer, terrifying brute force, the journey back to the distant town was an agonizing, blinding nightmare. The temperature plummeted to a deadly, unbearable extreme, rapidly freezing the moisture directly in the air, and forcefully turning the swirling snow into tiny, flying shards of jagged glass. Callahan simply bowed his massive, heavily bearded head directly against the violent onslaught, his incredibly broad shoulders completely absorbing the brutal punishment of the deadly storm without a single solitary complaint. His entire terrifying world narrowed down completely to the rhythmic, powerful plunging of his horse, massive hooves, and the tiny, completely steady warmth of the terrier, breathing softly against his chest. He would absolutely not let that gentle, heavily built widow suffer another agonizing, shattering loss. He would utterly destroy the cruel, mocking assumptions of that vile town, absolutely not with his fists, but with the profound, undeniable proof of his absolutely unwavering protection. He drove the massive horse relentlessly forward, completely refusing to yield to the deadly, freezing wrath of the mountains. Back in the suffocating, intensely oppressive heat of the mercantile, the atmosphere had grown completely toxic and utterly unbearable. The bitter, rat-faced storekeeper aggressively paced back and forth behind his long, polished wooden counter, deliberately slamming heavy, leather-bound ledger books and large tin canisters violently around to forcefully magnify his cruel, festering frustration. Evelyn remained entirely frozen on her hard, wooden cracker barrel, her heavy, beautifully soft frame practically folded entirely in half as she rocked silently back and forth. Her wide, absolutely terrified brown eyes stared blankly at the heavily frosted window panes, entirely unable to see the black, howling void outside. Every single shriek of the demonic wind violently pierced her gentle, completely fragile heart. The crushing, agonizing guilt was slowly, methodically suffocating her, violently wrapping its dark, heavy claws entirely around her throat. She continuously squeezed her eyes, tightly shut, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying thought that she had selfishly sent a truly good, honorable giant to a completely freezing, agonizing death. The storekeeper sneered deeply, leaning aggressively over the wooden counter to glare entirely directly at her trembling, beautifully curvy figure. He hated her softness, hated her quiet resilience, and utterly despised the fact that a wealthy, powerful man like Callahan had completely ignored the rest of the town just to help her. "You know," he mocked viciously, his nasally voice dripping with absolute, undeniable poison, "if that giant mountain man actually manages to survive this deadly, entirely foolish errand, he is going to absolutely despise you for dragging him out there into the freezing dark." Men like Callahan absolutely do not waste their precious, incredibly valuable time on heavy, weeping widows who cannot even manage to keep a tiny, utterly useless rat dog tied up properly. You have completely ruined your absolute last chance at finding any sort of pity or charity in this miserable town. When he comes back, if he magically comes back, he will walk completely right past you and absolutely never, ever look your pathetic way again. He will realize you are entirely a burden. Evelyn violently clamped her soft, trembling hands entirely over her ears, shutting her beautiful eyes tightly as completely fresh. Agonizing tears streamed rapidly down her flushed, heated cheeks. She desperately wanted to scream, to fiercely defend her precious, missing companion, to proudly declare that Barnaby was worth absolutely everything to her. But the horrific, crushing weight of the town's relentless cruelty had completely stolen her gentle voice. She felt utterly, profoundly unworthy. They had repeatedly, viciously told her she was entirely too large, completely too soft, and totally too emotional to survive the harsh, unforgiving frontier. And now, trapped entirely in the terrifying, claustrophobic darkness of the howling storm, she absolutely believed their vicious lies. She silently prepared her shattering, fragile heart for the horrific, completely inevitable moment when the town would finally drive her out entirely, throwing her heavily built frame out into the snow, completely alone and utterly broken. She merely pulled her incredibly threadbare black shawl tighter around her broad, heavy shoulders, sobbing entirely silently into the coarse wool, utterly defeated by the bitter man's relentless torment. But then, completely shattering the agonizing, toxic silence of the warm store, a massive, terrifying thud violently shook the entire front wall of the building. The storekeeper instantly jumped backward, gasping sharply, dropping a heavy, metallic tin of coffee beans directly onto the wooden floorboards. Ve capite hot, a loud, clattering crash. Evelyn's breath hitched violently in her tight throat, her entire heavy, curvy frame going absolutely, terrifyingly rigid. The heavy brass doorknob turned slowly, resisting the intense, freezing pressure from the outside. The sturdy, thick wooden door was violently forced completely open against the shrieking gale, entirely tearing the top iron hinge with a loud, agonizing groan. The blinding, terrifying whiteout violently and forcefully invaded the warm, dim room, swirling aggressively around the towering, incredibly massive silhouette, entirely blocking the wooden doorframe. Callahan stepped heavily into the quiet mercantile, turning and pulling the shattered, heavy door firmly and violently shut behind his massive frame, instantly cutting off the deafening, terrifying roar of the blizzard. He stood completely still in the entryway like an absolutely immovable, conquering titan. His immense, terrifyingly muscular chest heaved slowly, his heavy canvas duster completely coated in a thick, solid, blinding armor of freezing white ice. Chunks of packed snow melted rapidly from his dark, heavy beard, dripping steadily onto the clean, dry, wooden floorboards. His stoic, incredibly piercing gray eyes immediately swept the silent room, completely ignoring the pale, absolutely terrified storekeeper, zeroing in entirely on Evelyn's trembling, heavy figure huddled desperately by the cast-iron stove. The storekeeper stammered violently, retreating aggressively against the back shelves, utterly terrified of the imposing, deadly aura radiating powerfully from the giant cowboy. You actually made it back," the cowardly man whispered frantically, his arrogant, mocking demeanor completely and instantly evaporating entirely under Callahan's terrifying, perfectly silent presence. "You actually survived the dead gorge." Callahan did absolutely not even blink at the pathetic, trembling man. His face was a completely terrifying, stoic mask of absolute, undeniable authority. He walked with slow, incredibly deliberate, heavy strides entirely directly toward Evelyn. The wooden floorboards practically screamed in violent protest beneath his immense, terrifying weight. Evelyn slowly looked up at him, her large, beautifully sorrowful brown eyes overflowing with absolute, profound desperation. Her soft, heavy hands clutched the frayed edges of her threadbare shawl so tightly, her pale knuckles were stark white. She frantically scanned his massive, icy, imposing form, searching desperately for any single sign of her precious, missing companion, utterly terrified of what she might not find. He looked entirely down at her, his rugged, frozen, incredibly handsome face softening incredibly. He revealed a deeply tender, profound warmth that completely and utterly contradicted his terrifying, massive size. He slowly reached up with his thick, freezing, leather-clad hands and carefully, methodically unbuttoned the top section of his heavy, ice-caked canvas duster. Evelyn let out a sharp, completely ragged gasp, her beating heart stopping completely in her chest. From the deep, incredibly warm confines of his thick coat, a tiny, scruffy, completely dry head suddenly popped out. Barnaby let out a small, incredibly happy yip, his dark, bright eyes instantly locking entirely onto his weeping, desperate mother. Evelyn sobbed violently, completely losing the very last ounce of her remaining strength, dropping entirely to her knees on the hard, wooden floorboards. Her heavy, beautifully curvy frame shook uncontrollably with raw emotion as Callahan gently, reverently reached deep inside his coat and slowly pulled the warm, completely safe little terrier, completely free. He knelt heavily before her on the floor, completely ignoring the painful, freezing protest of his stiff joints, bringing his massive, towering frame entirely right down to her vulnerable level. He gently, incredibly softly, placed the tiny, wiggling dog directly into her soft, trembling, outstretched hands. Barnaby frantically licked the salty, warm tears streaming rapidly down Evelyn's flushed, beautiful cheeks, whimpering with absolute, pure joy, his tiny tail wagging furiously against her heavy dress. Evelyn buried her beautiful, tear-soaked face completely into the terrier's soft, warm fur, weeping with an agonizing, profound relief that seemed to wash away entirely years of terrifying, isolated torment. Callahan remained kneeling completely still right there in front of her, deliberately acting as a massive, completely immovable, protective shield between her heavy, highly vulnerable form and the cruel, highly judgmental eyes of the storekeeper. The sheer, immense size of his broad, imposing back completely blocked Evelyn from the rest of the hostile world, creating a tiny, incredibly safe sanctuary entirely just for her and her beloved dog. The bitter man behind the counter nervously cleared his throat, desperately and completely foolishly, trying to regain some pathetic semblance of his lost, arrogant control over the situation. Well, the coward muttered awkwardly, shuffling his boots nervously on the wooden planks, completely intimidated but entirely too arrogant to stay silent. Mort, suppose you got completely lucky, Callahan. But dragging a fine, wealthy man out into a deadly, freezing storm for a useless mongrel is still entirely foolish. You should absolutely teach this heavy, useless woman a stern lesson about wasting valuable resources. Callahan slowly stood up, his massive, towering frame unfurling completely, like a terrifying dark thundercloud suddenly and violently blocking out the sun. He turned his incredibly broad, massive back entirely on Evelyn, deliberately maintaining his shielding position, and slowly stepped directly toward the wooden counter. He did absolutely not raise his remarkably deep voice. He did completely not clench his massive, terrifying hands into fists. He simply rested his thick, heavy hands completely flatly on the wooden counter, leaned his massive, incredibly broad shoulders entirely forward, and stared completely directly into the storekeeper's rat-like terrified eyes. The silence that instantly followed was completely, suffocatingly heavy, actively radiating an undeniable, bone-rattling authority that instantly made the storekeeper violently tremble in his boots. "You will completely pack a crate," Callahan rumbled, his remarkably deep, resonant voice completely devoid of any raised anger, yet vibrating with an absolute, terrifying finality that shook the tin cans on the shelves. "Flour, sugar, blankets, the absolute best provisions you currently have. You will pack it completely silently. And if you ever, absolutely ever speak to this woman with anything less than absolute, total respect again, Mott will personally ensure this miserable, pathetic store completely never sees a single dime of my massive ranch's money for the entire rest of your miserable, bitter life." The storekeeper swallowed violently, his thin face turning completely ashen, nodding frantically as he immediately and desperately scrambled to grab a large wooden crate from beneath the counter, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. Callahan turned slowly back to Evelyn, his stoic, incredibly intense gray eyes entirely locked onto her tear-stained, incredibly beautiful, heavily curvy face. The profound, undeniable truth settled completely over the room. He had absolutely not braved the deadly, freezing gorge just for the dog. He had faced the terrifying, icy maw of death entirely for her. He slowly held out his massive, heavily calloused hand directly toward her kneeling form, his silent, incredibly profound gesture entirely and forever changing the trajectory of her broken life. Friends, there is a very specific, profound kind of terror that comes with finally being seen after spending your entire life desperately trying to remain invisible. Evelyn stared down at that massive, heavily calloused hand, suspended perfectly still in the warm, dim air of the mercantile, and her breath completely seized in her chest. For years, the brutal, unforgiving frontier town had forcefully conditioned her to believe that her heavy, full figure was an unsightly burden, a physical manifestation of her supposed unworthiness. The cruel, whispering women had always treated her as something entirely breakable, yet utterly undesirable, while the harsh men viewed her soft, curved silhouette as a sign of lazy weakness in a territory that demanded calloused, skeletal endurance. Yet, here was Callahan, the wealthiest, most intimidating mountain man in the entire Wyoming territory, kneeling before her on the dusty floorboards, offering his hand, not kept hot, arrogant pity, but with absolute unwavering respect. She slowly pulled her trembling, pale fingers from the frayed, damp edges of her worn woolen kept robe and carefully placed her soft palm entirely against his massive, scarred skin. The sheer, overwhelming physical contrast between them was breathtaking. His enormous, rugged fingers easily enveloped her beautifully plump hand, entirely radiating an intense, vital heat, that instantly chased the lingering, biting frost from her aching joints. He did completely not yank her roughly to her feet like a bothersome chore. Instead, he applied a perfectly measured, steady, incredibly gentle pressure, allowing her to find her own balance as he effortlessly guided her heavy, trembling body entirely upright. Across the room, the terrified, rat-faced storekeeper had aggressively packed a large, sturdy wooden crate with premium winter supplies, his trembling hands violently spilling a stream of white sugar across the wooden counter in his frantic, desperate haste to appease the giant. Callahan did absolutely not even cast a single glance in the cowardly man's direction. He simply guided Evelyn securely behind his broad, immovable back, treating her heavy, soft form like absolute royalty, completely shielding her from the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the room. With his free, incredibly muscular left arm, he effortlessly hoisted the massive, completely full wooden crate entirely off the counter, lifting a burden that would have easily required 2 average men to carry, as if it weighed absolutely nothing at all. He tucked the tiny, utterly exhausted terrier safely back inside the warm confines of his thick canvas coat, securely fastening the heavy brass buttons right over his broad chest. "Stay completely behind me," he rumbled, his deeply resonant, gravelly voice washing over her shattered nerves, like a profoundly soothing, warm mountain stream. "The wind is vicious tonight." Evelyn merely nodded silently, her wide, sorrowful brown eyes completely fixated on the incredibly broad, solid expanse of his shoulders as he easily kicked the heavy wooden door forcefully open, instantly exposing them back to the terrifying, screaming wrath of the deadly blizzard. The violent, blinding whiteout immediately attempted to aggressively swallow them whole, the shrieking gale violently whipping Evelyn's thick chestnut hair completely free from its loose, modest pins. But the absolute terror that had paralyzed her earlier was strangely absent, walking entirely in the massive, wind-breaking wake of Callahan's mountainous form. She felt a profound, deeply, entirely unfamiliar sense of absolute security. The freezing ice pelted completely harmlessly against his broad, imposing back, completely parting around his massive frame like water, breaking against a completely immovable granite boulder. They aggressively waded through the deep, treacherous, waist-high snowdrifts directly toward the massive black draft horse, waiting patiently near the frosted hitching post. Evelyn's heart instantly began to race with fresh, overwhelming anxiety. Her isolated, drafty, completely miserable shack was situated entirely on the absolute furthest, poorest edge of the town settlement, a punishing, freezing 2-mile walk through completely treacherous, unplowed terrain. She silently braced her heavy, exhausted body for the agonizing, freezing march, utterly dreading returning to the dark, suffocating emptiness of her freezing home. But Callahan completely shattered her bleak expectations. He smoothly and effortlessly secured the heavy wooden supply crate tightly to the rear leather saddlebags, with thick, incredibly strong leather straps, completely ignoring the screaming, biting wind. Then, he turned his massive, imposing frame directly toward her, his stoic, piercing gray eyes perfectly calm amidst the violent chaos of the swirling snow. Before she could even utter a single trembling word of confusion, his massive, incredibly warm hands clamped firmly and securely onto her softly curved, heavy waist. Evelyn gasped sharply, her entire body going completely rigid in sheer, unadulterated shock. Throughout her entire life, her significant, full-figured weight had completely anchored her to the ground, a constant, heavy, physical reality that she was constantly, painfully reminded of by the mocking townspeople. But in the incredibly powerful, massive grip of the giant rancher, she suddenly felt as weightless as a delicate floating sparrow. With a single, effortless, terrifying surge of raw physical power, Callahan lifted her heavy, profoundly curvy frame completely off the snowy ground, easily hoisting her directly up into the tall, winterized leather saddle. She scrambled frantically to grip the heavy leather horn, her soft face burning with an intense, agonizing blush of absolute embarrassment, completely certain she was absolutely crushing his majestic beast. But the massive horse did completely not even flinch, standing perfectly solid and unbothered beneath her heavy, soft weight. Callahan swung his immense, towering form effortlessly into the saddle directly behind her, his incredibly broad chest pressing perfectly and warmly against her trembling, incredibly vulnerable back. He reached his massive, thickly muscled arms completely around her sides to grab the heavy leather reins, effectively and deliberately caging her safely inside a profoundly secure, impenetrable fortress of radiating body heat and solid, protective muscle. Evelyn was entirely, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming physical intimacy. She had spent 2 brutal, agonizingly lonely years entirely without the comforting, warm touch of another human being, entirely starved for simple affection and basic kindness. Now, completely surrounded by the immense, rugged strength of this silent, deeply honorable giant, she felt a sudden, massive wave of exhausting, profound relief aggressively wash over her shivering limbs. Callahan nudged the massive draft horse powerfully forward, the giant beast violently breaking completely through the deep, mountainous snowdrifts with absolute, terrifying ease. Evelyn squeezed her eyes tightly shut, resting her freezing, rosy cheek gently against the thick, ice-caked canvas of his heavy sleeve, completely trusting him to navigate the blinding, treacherous dark. She fully expected the horse to slowly turn left down the narrow, unpaved alleyway leading directly toward her miserable, freezing, totally ruined cabin. She mentally began to desperately calculate exactly how she would stretch the newly acquired generous supplies from the wooden crate to last through the brutal, endless winter. Utterly terrified of facing the dark, suffocating isolation once he finally dropped her off. But the massive horse did absolutely not turn left. Instead, the powerful beast continued marching aggressively straight ahead, moving with powerful, heavy, ground-eating strides completely out of the miserable town limits entirely, heading directly up the steep, treacherous, winding mountain trail that led exclusively into the high, rugged country. Evelyn's beautiful, heavy brown eyes snapped completely open, completely filled with sudden, profound confusion. She frantically twisted her soft, curvy torso, slightly, desperately trying to look up at his stoic, incredibly handsome, heavily bearded face. "My cabin," she stammered weakly, her gentle, soft voice barely carrying over the deafening, shrieking roar of the violent blizzard. "We passed it. The turn is entirely back there. You are going completely the wrong way." Callahan did absolutely not stop the horse. He did completely not even slow the massive beast's powerful, rhythmic, forward momentum. He simply looked entirely down at her, his striking, intense gray eyes utterly unreadable in the dark, swirling void of the storm. He leaned his incredibly massive chest slightly closer, his deep, resonant voice rumbling powerfully against her spine, directly through the thick layers of their heavy winter clothing. "That broken, entirely freezing shack is absolutely not fit for a dog, let alone a woman of your profound worth," he stated with absolute, terrifying finality. "You are entirely not going back there. Not tonight, not completely ever again." Evelyn's breath hitched violently, a completely sudden, profound sense of panic, aggressively mingling with an incredibly strange, terrifyingly beautiful, blossoming hope deep within her fragile chest. No one had ever spoken to her with such absolute and commanding authority, wrapped so completely in profound, undeniable care. The entire town had repeatedly, viciously told her she completely deserved that miserable freezing shack because of her soft, heavy size, insisting she was entirely lucky to have even a single rotting roof over her deeply flawed head. To hear this powerful, massive, incredibly wealthy man casually and completely declare that she deserved significantly better, completely shattered the absolute foundation of her deep, agonizing insecurities. She wanted to passionately argue, to desperately insist she was entirely too much of a heavy burden, but the sheer, unyielding warmth radiating entirely from his massive, protective frame completely melted the desperate, panicked words right off her tongue. She merely sank deeper entirely into his massive, sheltering embrace, allowing the rhythmic, powerful sway of the giant horse to slowly carry her completely away from the cruel, mocking town that had actively tried to destroy her beautiful, gentle spirit. They rode continuously for they kept hot. A day felt like endless, freezing hours, ascending directly into the dark, heavily timbered throat of the rugged mountain. Gradually, the violent, shrieking wind began to dramatically lose its terrifying, aggressive fury, entirely broken by the massive, towering ancient pine trees that completely surrounded Callahan's vast, incredibly isolated property. The blinding, disorienting whiteout slowly transitioned into a gentle, entirely peaceful snowfall, the massive, pristine flakes drifting lazily down through the dark, quiet branches. Evelyn peered entirely out from the warm, secure shelter of Callahan's massive arms, her beautiful eyes widening completely in absolute, stunning awe. Looming massively out of the quiet, beautiful winter darkness stood a completely spectacular, enormous log fortress. It was a massive, incredibly sprawling, two-story ranch house built entirely of enormous, hand-peeled, interlocking timber, incredibly rugged, yet undeniably, stunningly majestic. Warm, brilliant, deeply inviting golden light poured rapidly from the heavy, thick glass windows, casting long, deeply beautiful, welcoming shadows entirely across the deep, untouched, pristine snow in the vast front yard. This was absolutely not a mere cabin. It was a completely impregnable, magnificent sanctuary built entirely by a man who demanded absolute, undeniable control over his harsh, unforgiving environment. Callahan expertly guided the massive, exhausted horse directly into a massive, heavily sheltered, deeply warm timber barn located adjacent to the magnificent main house. The immediate, profound silence entirely inside the sturdy, windproof structure was incredibly deafening after hours of battling the violent, screaming blizzard. The air was wonderfully thick with the deeply comforting, familiar scents of rich, sweet alfalfa hay, clean, polished saddle leather, and the heavy, warm, incredibly soothing musk of the dozen magnificent, healthy horses resting quietly in their massive, clean stalls. He easily swung his towering, entirely massive frame completely down from the heavy saddle, his heavy leather boots landing completely silently on the soft, straw-covered dirt floor. He turned directly toward Evelyn, completely reaching up with his immense, powerful hands to gently span her soft, beautifully full waist once again. She placed her trembling, soft hands completely onto his incredibly broad, solid shoulders, completely terrified that her significant, heavy weight would finally be utterly too much for him to handle gracefully. But Callahan completely lifted her heavy, softly curved frame down from the giant horse, with absolute, stunning, effortless reverence, gently lowering her entirely until her worn leather boots touched the soft ground perfectly. He did absolutely not let go of her right away, his massive, warm hands remaining perfectly, completely securely planted on her waist for just a single, agonizingly beautiful, tension-filled heartbeat, intensely making sure her freezing numb legs could completely support her significant weight. He moved completely to the saddlebags, effortlessly retrieving the massive, heavy wooden supply crate with one hand, before gently unbuttoning his thick, ice-caked canvas coat. He carefully reached inside and gently pulled out the completely dry, incredibly warm, entirely happy little terrier. Barnaby instantly wiggled wildly, letting out a joyful, high-pitched yip as Callahan gently and safely placed him entirely down onto the soft, warm hay. The tiny, completely revived dog immediately began to excitedly sniff the heavy timber walls, his tiny tail wagging furiously, entirely unbothered by his previous terrifying brush with a freezing, agonizing death. "Come inside," Callahan rumbled softly, gesturing with his massive heavy head directly toward the heavy, iron-bound side door that conveniently connected the massive barn directly to the warm main house. Evelyn nervously gathered the frayed, completely soaked edges of her heavy, worn woolen wrap tightly around her broad, soft shoulders, completely terrified to step directly into his private, luxurious domain. The very moment Callahan pushed the heavy wooden door entirely open, an incredible massive wave of pure, absolute radiating heat forcefully washed entirely over her freezing, exhausted body. She stepped completely hesitantly, directly into an enormous, beautifully rustic, incredibly expansive living space. A massive, roaring fire violently crackled and powerfully popped inside an absolutely gigantic, completely breathtaking, floor-to-soiling river stone fireplace, rapidly casting dancing, deeply warm orange shadows entirely across the heavily polished, rich, dark hardwood floors. The massive room was heavily decorated with thick, incredibly soft, luxurious furs, entirely draped heavily over massive, deeply comfortable leather furniture, silently reflecting the absolute immense, undeniable wealth and profound quiet isolation of the towering mountain man. Evelyn stood completely frozen directly near the heavy doorway, her heavy, wet boots actively dripping a small, incredibly pathetic puddle of freezing dirt directly onto his completely immaculate, pristine floorboards. The intense, deep shame aggressively crawled entirely back up her soft, flush throat. She felt completely, utterly, massive, incredibly out of place, and totally entirely unworthy to even exist inside such a magnificent, incredibly beautiful, pristine sanctuary. Callahan completely set the massive wooden crate easily onto a deeply polished, massive oak table, then turned directly toward her. He completely noticed her, shrinking violently back, entirely into the shadows, deeply recognizing the profound, heartbreaking terror actively shining directly in her wide, beautiful brown eyes. He closed the heavy, incredible distance entirely between them, with completely slow, deeply deliberate, incredibly measured strides, deliberately ensuring he completely did not startle her highly fragile, completely shattered nerves. He stopped exactly an arm's length directly away, slowly reaching his massive, heavily calloused hands entirely toward the top of her completely soaked, heavily freezing shawl. "Allow me," he murmured, his deep, resonant voice vibrating with absolute, undeniable gentleness. Evelyn completely froze, her breath absolutely catching in her throat as his incredibly massive, warm fingers gently, entirely carefully peeled the heavy, completely ruined wool entirely away from her heavily set, incredibly softly curved shoulders. The heavy, wet fabric fell completely to the floor with a dull, wet thud. For the very first time, completely since she had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving territory, she stood entirely, fully exposed in her deeply modest, heavily fitted, slightly worn widow's dress. The tightly fitted dark fabric completely accentuated her large, striking, heavily curved bosom, her wide, beautifully soft hips, and the significant, heavy thickness of her incredibly solid, soft thighs. She violently crossed her soft, entirely heavy arms completely over her stomach, a deeply, entirely defensive, heartbroken posture, completely squeezing her beautiful eyes entirely shut. She braced her shattered heart entirely for the inevitable, cruel, heavily mocking judgment. She frantically waited for him to openly sneer, to forcefully tell her she was completely too fat, entirely too soft, and totally useless, precisely exactly like the cruel, bitter storekeeper had viciously done entirely for years. But the suffocating, cruel silence she deeply anticipated was entirely broken by a completely different, incredibly profound, staggering sound. Callahan entirely let out a completely soft, deeply, incredibly ragged exhale, a sound of absolute, entirely undeniable, profound reverence. When Evelyn completely forced her heavily terrified, beautiful brown eyes entirely open, she did absolutely not see an ounce of pity, disgust, or mockery entirely in his striking, handsome, fully bearded face. Instead, his intense, completely piercing gray eyes were entirely sweeping heavily over her full, completely magnificent, heavy figure, with an absolute, breathtakingly pure, completely unadulterated awe. To his watchful, entirely protective soul, she was absolutely not flawed. She was not a heavy, entirely useless burden. She was an absolute, breathtakingly gorgeous, profoundly undeniable, magnificent survivor. He slowly reached down and effortlessly picked up a massive, incredibly thick, deeply luxurious dark wolf pelt directly from the back of the heavy leather sofa. He stepped completely into her entirely terrified space, and carefully, gently wrapped the incredibly warm, heavy, deeply soft fur completely around her broad, completely beautifully curved shoulders. No one is ever going to completely look entirely at you with anything less than absolute respect in this house. Evelyn, he rumbled entirely softly, his completely massive, heavy hands gently resting firmly on top of the incredibly warm fur, perfectly anchoring her safely to the incredibly beautiful present moment. The entire, incredibly cruel town completely threw away a magnificent, profound treasure, merely because they are completely entirely too blind to fully comprehend absolutely undeniable perfection. You are safe entirely here. You are completely entirely safe. Evelyn's completely shattered, heavy heart utterly and violently broke directly open in that precise, profoundly beautiful moment. The incredibly warm, soft tears instantly spilled entirely down her flushed, beautiful cheeks entirely. Not tears of absolute, profound agony, but entirely of a massive, overwhelming, utterly staggering relief. For the entirely absolute first time, completely in her entire, heavily mocked existence, she entirely and absolutely truly believed him. Friends, There is a very fragile, incredibly beautiful kind of magic that happens in the quiet hours immediately following a terrible, raging storm. When a soul has been ruthlessly battered by freezing winds and starved of basic human decency for years, the sudden, overwhelming introduction of pure, unconditional warmth can almost feel like a terrifying dream. You almost refuse to close your eyes, convinced that the very moment you drift off to sleep, the beautiful illusion will shatter, violently plunging you right back into the dark, freezing nightmare. We left our gentle, heavily built widow finally believing, for the absolute first time in her deeply tragic life, that she was truly safe. That night, enveloped in the breathtaking, massive log fortress of the giant mountain man, Evelyn experienced the most profound, restorative sleep she had known since her late husband passed. She woke up slowly, her beautiful, heavy brown eyes fluttering open to the brilliant, blinding white sunlight, reflecting powerfully off the deep mountain snow outside the frost-rimmed bedroom window. The agonizing, bitter cold that usually stiffened her joints and violently rattled her teeth every single morning was entirely absent. Instead, she found her exquisite, curvy frame buried underneath a mountain of plush, luxurious goose-down quilts and thick, heavenly soft furs. The sturdy four-poster bed she lay in was fit for royalty, perfectly accommodating her significant, beautiful weight without a single, protesting creak. She lay perfectly still for a long, quiet moment, her flushed cheek resting against the finest, smoothest cotton pillowcase she had ever felt, desperately trying to process the staggering reality of her new surroundings. The magnificent, expansive guest room was wonderfully warm, actively heated by a perfectly built stone hearth in the corner, where thick oak logs popped and hissed cheerfully. Her mind frantically raced, completely overwhelmed by the intense, undeniable luxury and the profoundly gentle, protective way Callahan had carried her directly to this absolute sanctuary. She slowly pushed the luxurious blankets back, her bare, soft feet sinking into a thick white bearskin rug, draped elegantly over the polished hardwood floor. The sheer physical contrast between this wealthy haven and the rotting, drafty shack the town had forced her into was staggering. A wave of fresh, undeniable anxiety violently gripped her fragile chest. She felt like a complete imposter. She looked down at her incredibly worn, modest widow's dress, horrified by the frayed hems, the faded, threadbare fabric, and the undeniable way it clung so tightly to her wide, soft hips and large bosom. The cruel, vicious voices of the townswoman immediately began to echo loudly in her mind, aggressively whispering that she was too large, too poor, and too pathetic to ever belong in a flawless home like this. She vigorously rubbed her trembling hands over her heated face, desperately trying to banish the toxic, suffocating memories. She quickly smoothed out the wrinkles in her dark, damp skirt, frantically pinning her thick, chestnut hair back into its tight, modest bun, trying to make herself look presentable, utterly terrified that Callahan would look at her in the harsh morning light and realize he had made a massive mistake. As she cautiously opened the intricately carved bedroom door, an intoxicating heavenly aroma wafted up the grand wooden staircase. The rich, robust scent of freshly brewed black coffee mingled with the mouth-watering, savory smell of thick-cut, frying bacon and warm, sweet buttermilk biscuits. Her stomach rumbled, a deep, painful hollow ache reminding her that she had survived on nothing but a few meager, rock-hard scraps of stale bread for the last 4 days. She descended the heavy stairs, at extreme, deliberate caution, terrified that her soft footsteps would disturb the profound peace of the magnificent house. She followed the inviting smells down the wide hallway, eventually stepping directly into an absolutely massive, breathtaking, sun-drenched frontier kitchen. Callahan was standing near a roaring, black cast-iron cook stove, his towering muscular frame dominating the vast room. He had shed his canvas duster and woolen coat, now wearing only a crisp, clean white cotton shirt, stretched tightly over his impossibly broad shoulders and powerful arms. He was methodically flipping sizzling strips of bacon in an iron skillet with practiced ease. His rugged, heavily bearded, handsome face was relaxed, his piercing, intelligent gray eyes softly focused on the simple, domestic task. The overwhelming juxtaposition of this terrifying, deadly giant casually and perfectly cooking a massive breakfast was profoundly breathtaking. Sitting happily right near his leather-booted feet was Barnaby. The tiny, scruffy terrier was enthusiastically devouring a heavy tin bowl filled they-kept hat, warm milk and expensive prime-cut beef trimming, his little tail wagging so furiously, his entire back half shook. Barnaby let out a joyful, muffled bark, pausing his frantic eating just long enough to happily trot over and gently nudge his wet nose against Evelyn's dark skirt. Callahan slowly turned his massive head, his piercing, unreadable gray eyes instantly locking onto her nervous, trembling figure, standing rigidly in the doorway. He did not smile, but a profound, deep warmth violently flared directly in his striking eyes. A silent, undeniable look of pure appreciation that swept from the top of her flushed face down to the soft, heavy curves of her nervous stance. "Morning," he rumbled, his deep, gravelly voice effortlessly vibrating through the magnificent timber walls, wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. "Sit. It is ready." Evelyn froze, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She slowly walked toward the intricately carved, heavy oak dining table, sitting in the center of the sunlit room. She hesitated, her trembling hands aggressively clutching the back of a sturdy wooden chair. She was paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming terror of actually sitting down and eating directly in front of another human being. For agonizing, brutal years, the bitter town had forcefully turned the simple, natural act of eating into a profound, terrifying source of shame for her. The lean, skeletal frontier women had viciously mocked her soft, full figure, loudly whispering at church gatherings that heavily built women like her were gluttonous, stealing vital resources from the truly hard-working, lean folks. The toxic shame had become deeply ingrained into her fragile bones, forcing her to eat her meager rations in the freezing dark, terrified of being judged. Callahan moved effortlessly away from the roaring stove, carrying two massive, loaded porcelain plates. He gently set one they-kept precisely at the head of the long table, and placed the other directly in front of the chair Evelyn was gripping. She stared down at the overwhelming feast. An enormous, thick stack of golden, fluffy buttermilk pancakes was smothered in rich, melting yellow butter and warm, sweet amber syrup. Alongside it sat 4 perfectly fried, bright yellow eggs and a generous mountain of heavily crisped bacon. It was pure, undeniable abundance. It was vastly more nourishing food than she had ever seen in one single sitting in her tragically deprived adult life. Her beautifully flushed face drained of all color. The mocking voices screamed inside her terrified head, insisting she did not deserve this, that she was too large, totally unworthy of such rich sustenance. She frantically took a sudden heavy step backward, her beautiful, sorrowful brown eyes filling hot, panicked. "Tears. Mott, cannot," she stammered, her fragile, gentle voice shaking. "Mott, I'm sorry. Mott, I'm not hungry. It is too much. I should not." Callahan slowly set down his silver fork, pausing his own massive meal. The relaxed, domestic softness instantly vanished from his rugged face, replaced by an intense, terrifyingly profound, fiercely protective focus. He deeply understood instantly exactly what was torturing her fragile mind. He had spent months silently watching the vindictive town destroy her incredible spirit, completely aware of how they had weaponized her beautiful, profound, physical softness against her. He slowly, deliberately pushed his heavy chair back from the huge oak table, the thick wood scraping loudly against the floorboards. He stood up, his towering, immense frame casting a deep, safe, comforting shadow over her trembling figure. He slowly walked around the heavy wooden table, ignoring the rules of polite, formal distance, stepping right into her terrified space. He did not touch her, deliberately allowing her panicked nerves to fully process his safe proximity. He simply leaned his powerful hands heavily onto the back of the sturdy wooden chair she had just abandoned, his striking gray eyes fiercely locking onto her weeping face. "Evelyn," he commanded deeply, his highly resonant voice dropping to a quiet, utterly undeniable rumble of absolute, perfect authority. "Look directly at me." She gasped, helplessly caught in the magnetic, intensely powerful pull of his commanding presence. She fearfully raised her soft, tear-streaked face, bracing herself for the cruel reprimand she expected. But she found none. Instead, looking directly down into her terrified soul, was a man who saw nothing but undeniable worth. "Those bitter, miserable cowards down in that rotting, pathetic town wanted you to starve," he stated smoothly, his powerful voice vibrating with a dangerous, cold fury directed exclusively at her vicious tormentors. They wanted you to shrink, to disappear into the freezing dark, simply because your magnificent, heavy softness terrified their hollow, miserable souls. You listened to their vicious lies. He slowly, gently reached one massive, heavily calloused, warm hand directly toward her soft, flushed cheek. He barely lightly brushed a single warm tear away from her perfect skin with the rough pad of his massive thumb. "You are not shrinking in this house," he declared, his deep, heavy words striking her utterly fragile heart like a warm, massive iron hammer of absolute truth. "You are incredibly beautiful exactly as you are. Your heavy, perfect softness is a profound testament to the deep, warm, loving heart beating inside of you." The profound, staggering weight of his words broke the final, frozen dam around her heart. Evelyn wept, not with the agonizing despair of the past 2 years, but with the sudden, violent rush of a woman returning to life. She finally allowed herself to believe that in this massive, isolated fortress, she was safe, she was seen, and for the first time in her life, she was entirely enough. Friends, when a woman who has spent her entire life apologizing for simply taking up space is finally told that she is not only allowed to exist, but is profoundly cherished exactly as she is, something within her irrevocably shifts. The terrified, shrinking girl from the rotting frontier town died that morning in Callahan's sun-drenched kitchen, and a stunning, quietly powerful woman began to take her first, tentative breaths. We left our gentle, heavily built Evelyn weeping tears of profound relief, as the towering mountain man systematically dismantled every cruel, vicious lie she had ever been forced to believe about her own worth. Callahan did not rush her tears. He simply stood there, an immovable, towering bastion of absolute safety, his incredibly broad chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm. He kept his massive, warm hand gently resting near her soft, flushed cheek, offering a grounding, physical tether to reality, while the overwhelming, agonizing weight of her past trauma slowly drained from her trembling shoulders. When her ragged, violent sobs finally began to subside into quiet, exhausted hiccups, he withdrew his hand with slow, deliberate care, respecting her vulnerable space. He pulled out the heavy wooden chair she had abandoned and, with a silent, commanding gesture of his large hand, indicated for her to sit. Evelyn complied, her legs feeling like weak, trembling water. She sank heavily onto the sturdy wood, her beautiful, sorrowful brown eyes still shimmering with unshed tears, but the absolute, suffocating terror that had gripped her moments before was entirely gone. Callahan returned to his seat at the head of the massive oak table. He picked up his heavy silver fork and smoothly, casually resumed his own meal, deliberately removing the intense, overwhelming focus from her fragile state. "Eat," he rumbled softly, his deep, gravelly voice a gentle, rhythmic command. "The cold will take a heavy toll if you do not stoke the fire." Evelyn looked down at the towering, impossible stack of golden, syrupy pancakes. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up her fork, but this time the paralyzing, toxic shame was miraculously absent. She took a small, hesitant bite. The incredibly rich, sweet, buttery flavor exploded across her tongue, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the hard, tasteless rations she was entirely accustomed to. For the absolute first time in 2 brutal years, she did not taste guilt or failure. She simply tasted incredibly good food. She took another bite, then another, the profound, nourishing warmth slowly spreading down into her freezing, hollow core, reviving her exhausted, deeply battered spirit. They ate the remainder of the massive meal in a comfortable, entirely profound silence. It was not the tense, terrifying silence of the town's mercantile, filled with unspoken, mocking judgment. It was the rich, peaceful silence of 2 solitary, deeply scarred souls recognizing a shared, unspoken understanding. Callahan did not bombard her with intrusive, demanding questions about her past or her late husband. He did not ask her to justify her presence in his magnificent home. He simply offered her the absolute, undeniable right to exist peacefully within his domain. After the heavy plates were cleared, Callahan moved to the massive front window, pulling back the thick, heavy canvas drapes to reveal the absolute, terrifying magnitude of the storm they had escaped. The blizzard still raged outside with unholy, demonic fury, effectively burying the entire mountain in a blinding, impassable whiteout. "We are snowed in," he stated simply, his deep voice carrying absolutely no trace of concern. "The pass will be completely blocked for at least 3 days. The town cannot reach us, and we cannot reach them. You and the dog are safe here until the thaw." Evelyn's heart did a strange, completely unexpected flutter. 3 days. 3 entire, uninterrupted days completely isolated from the cruel mocking stares, the vicious whispered insults, and the constant, agonizing struggle merely to survive. 3 days locked away in this breathtaking, incredibly warm sanctuary, with a giant who looked at her soft, heavy figure as if she were a magnificent, priceless prize. She nervously smoothed the faded, threadbare fabric of her dark skirt, a sudden, acute awareness of her deeply impoverished appearance washing over her. She desperately wanted to be useful, to somehow earn her keep in this magnificent fortress, utterly terrified of overstaying her welcome. "If you have any mending," she offered softly, her gentle voice still raspy from crying, "or if you need the floors swept, Moat am quite capable. Moat do not want to be a burden." Callahan turned slowly from the frosted window, his striking, piercing gray eyes instantly locking onto her nervous, beautiful face. He crossed his massive, incredibly thick arms slowly over his broad chest, his powerful stance radiating a quiet, absolute authority that made her breath hitch. "You are not a hired hand, Evelyn," he rumbled, his tone deliberately low and entirely unyielding. "And you are absolutely not a burden. This house has been entirely too quiet for far too long." He gestured with his massive chin toward a wide, inviting archway leading off the main living area. "The library is through there. The fires are lit. Rest, read, heal." He did not wait for her to argue. He simply turned and strode purposefully toward the heavy side door leading back to the barn, his massive, heavy boots completely silent on the hardwood floors. He had chores to tend to, animals that relied on his immense strength for survival. He left her standing in the center of the magnificent, sunlit kitchen, completely entirely alone, yet for the absolute first time in her life, she did not feel isolated. Evelyn cautiously explored the sprawling, deeply luxurious first floor of the massive log house. Barnaby trotted happily at her heels, his tiny, scruffy claws clicking softly against the polished wood, his belly round and full. She eventually found herself standing in the doorway of the library, completely breathless, at the sheer, breathtaking scale of the room. 2 entire, massive walls were completely lined from the floor to the vaulted, heavy timber ceiling with thousands of rich, leather-bound books. A huge, roaring fire crackled merrily in another stunning stone hearth, casting a warm, deeply inviting golden glow over the plush, incredibly soft leather armchairs and the thick, luxurious Persian rug scattered across the floor. It was a room entirely designed for quiet, intellectual retreat, a stark, unbelievable contrast to the rugged, brutal reality of the frozen frontier outside. She spent the entire blissful afternoon curled deeply into one of the massive, incredibly soft leather armchairs. A thick, heavy woolen blanket draped securely over her broad, soft lap. Barnaby snored softly, curled into a tight, warm ball directly against her heavy thigh. She carefully traced the embossed, golden lettering on the spines of the incredible books, completely losing herself in stories of distant, exotic lands and grand, sweeping adventures. For those few incredibly precious hours, the cruel, bitter town, the agonizing loss of her husband, and the terrifying, daily struggle for basic survival completely ceased to exist. She was simply a woman, warm, fully fed, and profoundly, undeniably safe. As the dim gray afternoon light slowly began to fade, casting long, deep purple shadows across the massive, snow-covered valley, the heavy side door opened. Callahan returned, bringing the sharp, incredibly clean scent of pine needles, freezing snow, and rich leather into the warm, quiet house. He stamped his heavy boots forcefully on the thick mat, shaking the fresh powder from his massive, broad shoulders. He walked slowly into the library, his towering, imposing frame instantly shrinking the massive room. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood near the roaring fire, holding his massive freezing hands out toward the dancing, warm flames, his intense, striking gray eyes quietly watching her from the corner of his vision. Evelyn nervously closed her heavy, leather-bound book, suddenly incredibly self-conscious of her relaxed, highly informal posture. She quickly moved to sit up straighter, her soft hands flying up to frantically check the tight, modest pins in her thick hair. But Callahan slowly raised one massive, calloused hand, a silent, deeply gentle command for her to remain exactly as she was. He reached into the deep, heavy pocket of his canvas duster and slowly pulled out a small, incredibly delicate, intricately carved wooden box. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy steps deliberate and quiet. He stopped right beside her chair and gently placed the beautiful small box directly onto the heavy, polished side table. "Mott found this in the mercantile yesterday," he stated quietly, his deep, resonant voice completely filling the quiet space between them. Right before the storm hit, Evelyn stared at the small, beautiful box, her heart suddenly beginning to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She slowly, completely hesitantly reached out, with her soft, trembling fingers, and carefully lifted the delicate wooden lid. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of dark, rich velvet, was a stunning, incredibly delicate silver locket. It was entirely unadorned, completely free of any flashy, ostentatious jewels, possessing a simple, elegant, deeply profound beauty that absolutely stole her breath. "Motka no ove. Kepit cannot possibly replace everything they have violently taken from you," Callahan rumbled, his deep, gravelly voice absolutely thick with an unspoken, fiercely protective tenderness. "But Mort entirely wanted you to have something that belonged absolutely only to you. Something that bitter, rotting town could completely never, ever take away." Evelyn stared down at the cool, smooth silver, her vision instantly blurring as completely fresh, incredibly hot tears rapidly welled in her beautiful brown eyes. This was not merely a simple piece of jewelry. It was a profound, physical manifestation of his absolute, unwavering promise. A silent, undeniable vow of protection, of absolute respect, and of a completely new future, where she would absolutely never again have to apologize for simply existing. She slowly looked up at the towering, silent giant, her heavy, fragile heart completely overflowing with an emotion so incredibly powerful. It entirely stole her breath. He had not just saved her physical life from the deadly, freezing storm. He was actively, methodically saving her entire, shattered soul from the terrifying, agonizing isolation of her own mind. Friends, when you spend your entire life being told you are entirely too much, too heavy, too soft, too emotional, you eventually start trying to make yourself incredibly small. You fold your beautiful, curvy shoulders inward, you quiet your gentle voice, and you accept the scraps of affection the cruel world decides to throw your way. But when a towering, immovable mountain of a man looks at you and essentially declares that you are a priceless treasure, that deeply ingrained instinct to shrink violently collides with a terrifying, blossoming desire to finally bloom. We left Evelyn sitting in the fire-lit library, entirely overwhelmed by the profound gift of the silver locket and the undeniable, fierce protection radiating from Callahan. The blizzard raged relentlessly outside for the next 2 days, effectively turning the massive log fortress into a completely isolated, impregnable island. The violent winds shrieked against the heavy timber walls, rattling the thick glass panes, but inside, the atmosphere was a profound, deeply comforting haven of quiet warmth. Those 2 days became a careful, incredibly delicate dance between two deeply scarred, solitary souls. Callahan was a man of very few words. He did not fill the quiet spaces with unnecessary chatter or probing, invasive questions. He communicated primarily through absolute, undeniable action. He kept the massive stone hearths roaring with thick oak logs, ensuring the sprawling house was always comfortably warm. He cooked rich, incredibly nourishing meals, silently placing overflowing plates in front of her, his stoic, gray eyes holding a silent, unyielding demand that she eat every single bite. Evelyn, entirely unaccustomed to being the recipient of such deliberate, focused care, initially struggled with a deep, agonizing sense of unworthiness. The first time he brought her a steaming mug of sweet tea while she was reading, she had practically leaped from her chair, frantically apologizing for being idle. Callahan had simply set the heavy ceramic mug down on the side table, his massive hands resting gently on the back of her chair. "You are resting," he had rumbled, his deep voice carrying absolutely no judgment. "That is entirely the purpose of this room. Drink your tea." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tightly coiled, terrified spring inside her fragile chest began to unwind. She started to realize that his silence was not the angry, brooding silence of the bitter men in town. It was a peaceful, deeply observant quiet. He watched her constantly. When she sat by the fire, her soft, heavy hands expertly knitting a thick woolen scarf from yarn she had found in a sewing basket, she would often glance up to find his intense, piercing gray eyes entirely locked onto her. He wasn't staring with the sneering, mocking contempt she was tragically used to. He watched her the way a man watches a breathtaking, incredibly rare sunrise, entirely captivated by her gentle movements and the soft, beautiful curves of her full figure illuminated by the golden firelight. On the afternoon of the third day, the violent demonic howling of the wind finally began to die down, shifting into a low, mournful moan before ceasing entirely. The sudden profound silence was almost deafening. Callahan stood by the massive front window, pulling back the heavy canvas drapes. The sky was a brilliant, blinding, crystal-clear blue, the midday sun reflecting powerfully off the mountainous, completely untouched snowdrifts that had entirely buried the front porch. "The pass will be clear by tomorrow morning," he stated quietly, his broad, muscular back facing her. Evelyn sat rigidly in the plush leather armchair, her beautiful, heavy hands freezing entirely in her lap. The warm, protective bubble they had existed in for 3 days was violently threatening to pop. Tomorrow meant the brutal, unforgiving reality of the town. Tomorrow meant returning to the freezing, drafty shack, the cruel, whispering women, and the bitter, mocking storekeeper. The terrifying, suffocating anxiety she had managed to push away aggressively rushed back in, violently tightening her throat and making her chest ache with a sudden, profound despair. She looked down at her hands, her soft fingers gently tracing the delicate, smooth silver of the locket. Resting securely against her heavy bosom, she could not go back. The mere thought of returning to that miserable, isolating existence after tasting this incredible, profound safety was entirely unbearable. But she was also utterly terrified of assuming she was welcome to stay. She was a destitute, heavily built widow. He was a wealthy, powerful, incredibly handsome rancher. The chasm between their social standings in the harsh frontier was massive and undeniable. "Not suppose I should gather my things," she whispered, her gentle, fragile voice completely betraying the agonizing, heavy sorrow crushing her heart. "Mott cannot possibly impose on your incredible hospitality any longer." Callahan turned slowly from the frosted window. His rugged, heavily bearded face was a terrifying, completely unreadable mask. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped violently beneath his skin. He crossed the massive room with slow, incredibly deliberate, heavy strides, the floorboards groaning slightly beneath his immense weight. He stopped directly in front of her chair, his towering, imposing frame casting a deep, protective shadow over her trembling figure. He did not speak. Instead, he slowly, carefully knelt on the thick Persian rug, bringing his striking, intense gray eyes entirely level with hers. He reached out and gently, incredibly softly took both of her trembling soft hands in his massive, heavily calloused ones. His immense thumbs slowly, methodically stroked the soft, delicate skin of her knuckles, the profound, vital heat of his touch, instantly sending a violent, beautiful shiver straight down her spine. "Impose?" he repeated, his deeply resonant, gravelly voice dropping to a quiet, utterly dangerous rumble. "You think your presence in this house is an imposition?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her beautiful, sorrowful brown eyes filling rapidly with panicked tears. Mott have absolutely nothing." "Callahan," she choked out, the agonizing, deeply ingrained shame finally breaking free. "Mott am completely destitute. Mott am entirely too large, too heavy, and completely useless. Mott have absolutely nothing to offer a man like you. The town, they are completely right about me. Mott am just a heavy burden." Callahan's intense gray eyes flared with a sudden, terrifying, cold fury, not at her, but at the absolute, vile cruelty of the people who had forced her to believe such horrific, devastating lies. He tightened his massive, warm grip on her soft hands, refusing entirely to let her pull away and hide in her shame. "Listen to me very carefully, Evelyn," he commanded, his deep voice vibrating with an absolute, undeniable, bone-rattling truth. "The people in that rotting, miserable town are completely, entirely blind. They look at your magnificent, soft strength and see weakness because they are utterly terrified of anything they cannot easily break. They look at your profound, heavy curves and see a burden because they are entirely too weak too hollow to appreciate true, undeniable beauty. He released one of her hands and slowly, gently reached up to cup her flushed, tear-streaked cheek. His massive, rough hand was incredibly warm, his touch holding a profound, staggering reverence that completely stole her breath. "You are absolutely not a burden," he stated, his thumb lightly brushing away a fresh tear. "You are the absolute only warmth this massive empty house has felt in years. When Moat look at you, Evelyn, Moat do not see a flaw. Moat see a completely breathtaking, incredibly resilient woman who survived a living hell with her gentle, beautiful heart entirely intact." Evelyn stared at him, utterly paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his confession. No man had ever spoken to her with such raw, unvarnished honesty. No man had ever looked at her heavy, curvy figure and declared it magnificent. She searched his striking, handsome face desperately for any sign of pity or mockery, but she found absolutely none. There was only a fierce, unwavering, utterly terrifying devotion. "You are not going back to that freezing shack," Callahan continued, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are not going back to those cruel, bitter cowards. You belong here, with me." The profound, staggering weight of his words finally, entirely shattered the last remaining remnants of her deep-seated fear. She wept, a sudden, violent, entirely cleansing release of years of agonizing, silent suffering. She leaned heavily forward, completely burying her tear-soaked, beautiful face directly into his massive, incredibly broad, muscular chest. Callahan's massive arms instantly wrapped entirely around her heavy, soft frame, pulling her tightly against his violently beating heart. He held her with a terrifying, absolute strength, fiercely declaring to the silent, empty room and the frozen mountains outside that this magnificent, heavily built woman was entirely, irrevocably his to protect. Friends, when you spend your entire life being told you are entirely too much, too heavy, too soft, too emotional, you eventually start trying to make yourself incredibly small. You fold your beautiful, curvy shoulders inward, you quiet your gentle voice, and you accept the scraps of affection the cruel world decides to throw your way. But when a towering, immovable mountain of a man looks at you and essentially declares that you are a priceless treasure, that deeply ingrained instinct to shrink violently collides with a terrifying, blossoming desire to finally bloom. We left Evelyn sitting in the fire-lit library, entirely overwhelmed by the profound gift of the silver locket and the undeniable, fierce protection radiating from Callahan. The blizzard raged relentlessly outside for the next 2 days, effectively turning the massive log fortress into a completely isolated, impregnable island. The violent winds shrieked against the heavy timber walls, rattling the thick glass panes, but inside, the atmosphere was a profound, deeply comforting haven of quiet warmth. Those 2 days became a careful, incredibly delicate dance between two deeply scarred, solitary souls. Callahan was a man of very few words. He did not fill the quiet spaces with unnecessary chatter or probing, invasive questions. He communicated primarily through absolute, undeniable action. He kept the massive stone hearths roaring with thick oak logs, ensuring the sprawling house was always comfortably warm. He cooked rich, incredibly nourishing meals, silently placing overflowing plates in front of her, his stoic gray eyes holding a silent, unyielding demand that she eat every single bite. Evelyn, entirely unaccustomed to being the recipient of such deliberate, focused care, initially struggled with a deep, agonizing sense of unworthiness. The first time he brought her a steaming mug of sweet tea while she was reading, she had practically leaped from her chair. Frantically apologizing for being idle, Callahan had simply set the heavy ceramic mug down on the side table, his massive hands resting gently on the back of her chair. "You are resting," he had rumbled, his deep voice carrying absolutely no judgment. "That is entirely the purpose of this room. Drink your tea." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tightly coiled, terrified spring inside her fragile chest began to unwind. She started to realize that his silence was not the angry, brooding silence of the bitter men in town. It was a peaceful, deeply observant quiet. He watched her constantly. When she sat by the fire, her soft, heavy hands expertly knitting a thick woolen scarf from yarn she had found in a sewing basket, she would often glance up to find his intense, piercing gray eyes entirely locked onto her. He wasn't staring with the sneering, mocking tempt she was tragically used to. He watched her the way a man watches a breathtaking, incredibly rare sunrise, entirely captivated by her gentle movements and the soft, beautiful curves of her full figure, illuminated by the golden firelight. On the afternoon of the third day, the violent, demonic howling of the wind finally began to die down, shifting into a low, mournful moan before ceasing entirely. The sudden, profound silence was almost deafening. Callahan stood by the massive front window, pulling back the heavy canvas drapes. The sky was a brilliant, blinding, crystal-clear blue, the midday sun reflecting powerfully off the mountainous, completely untouched, snowdrifts that had entirely buried the front porch. "The pass will be clear by tomorrow morning," he stated quietly, his broad, muscular back facing her. Evelyn sat rigidly in the plush leather armchair, her beautiful heavy hands freezing entirely in her lap. The warm, protective bubble they had existed in for 3 days was violently threatening to pop. Tomorrow meant the brutal, unforgiving reality of the town. Tomorrow meant returning to the freezing, drafty shack, the cruel, whispering women, and the bitter, mocking storekeeper. The terrifying, suffocating anxiety she had managed to push away aggressively rushed back in, violently tightening her throat and making her chest ache with a sudden, profound despair. She looked down at her hands, her soft fingers, gently tracing the delicate, smooth silver of the locket, resting securely against her heavy bosom. She could not go back. The mere thought of returning to that miserable, isolating existence after tasting this incredible, profound safety was entirely unbearable. But she was also utterly terrified of assuming she was welcome to stay. She was a destitute, heavily built widow. He was a wealthy, powerful, incredibly handsome rancher. The chasm between their social standings in the harsh frontier was massive and undeniable. "Not suppose I should gather my things," she whispered, her gentle, fragile voice completely betraying the agonizing, heavy sorrow crushing her heart. "Mott cannot possibly impose on your incredible hospitality any longer." Callahan turned slowly from the frosted window. His rugged, heavily bearded face was a terrifying, completely unreadable mask, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped violently beneath his skin. He crossed the massive room with slow, incredibly deliberate, heavy strides, the floorboards groaning slightly beneath his immense weight. He stopped directly in front of her chair, his towering, imposing frame casting a deep protective shadow over her trembling figure. He did not speak. Instead, he slowly, carefully knelt on the thick Persian rug, bringing his striking, intense gray eyes entirely level with hers. He reached out and gently, incredibly softly, took both of her trembling, soft hands in his massive, heavily calloused ones. His immense thumbs slowly, methodically stroked the soft, delicate skin of her knuckles, the profound, vital heat of his touch, instantly sending a violent, beautiful shiver straight down her spine. "Impose?" he repeated, his deeply resonant, gravelly voice dropping to a quiet, utterly dangerous rumble. "You think your presence in this house is an imposition?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her beautiful, sorrowful brown eyes filling rapidly with panicked tears. Mort of absolutely nothing, Callahan." She choked out the agonizing, deeply ingrained shame, finally breaking free. "Mortem completely destitute. Mortem entirely too large, too heavy, and completely useless. Mort have absolutely nothing to offer a man like you. The town, they are completely right about me. Mort am just a heavy burden." Callahan's intense gray eyes flared with a sudden, terrifying, cold fury. Not at her, but at the absolute, vile cruelty of the people who had forced her to believe such horrific, devastating lies. He tightened his massive, warm grip on her soft hands, refusing entirely to let her pull away and hide in her shame. "Listen to me very carefully, Evelyn," he commanded, his deep voice vibrating with an absolute, undeniable, bone-rattling truth. "The people in that rotting, miserable town are completely, entirely blind. They look at your magnificent, soft strength and see weakness because they are utterly terrified of anything they cannot easily break. They look at your profound, heavy curves and see a burden because they are entirely too weak, too hollow, to appreciate true, undeniable beauty." He released one of her hands and slowly, gently reached up to cup her flushed, tear-streaked cheek. His massive, rough hand was incredibly warm, his touch holding a profound, staggering reverence that completely stole her breath. You are absolutely not a burden, he stated, his thumb lightly brushing away a fresh tear. You are the absolute only warmth this massive empty house has felt in years. When Mort look at you, Evelyn, Mort do not see a flaw. Mort see a completely breathtaking, incredibly resilient woman, who survived a living hell with her gentle, beautiful heart entirely intact. Evelyn stared at him, utterly paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his confession. No man had ever spoken to her with such raw, unvarnished honesty. No man had ever looked at her heavy, curvy figure and declared it magnificent. She searched his striking, handsome face desperately for any sign of pity or mockery, but she found absolutely none. There was only a fierce, unwavering, utterly terrifying devotion. You are not going back to that freezing shack, Callahan continued, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. You are not going back to those cruel, bitter cowards. You belong here, with me. The profound, staggering weight of his words finally entirely shattered the last remaining remnants of her deep-seated fear. She wept, a sudden, violent, entirely cleansing release of years of agonizing, silent suffering. She leaned heavily forward, completely burying her tear-soaked, beautiful face directly into his massive, incredibly broad, muscular chest. Callahan's massive arms instantly wrapped entirely around her heavy, soft frame, pulling her tightly against his violently beating heart. He held her with a terrifying, absolute strength, fiercely declaring to the silent, empty room and the frozen mountains outside that this magnificent, heavily built woman was entirely, irrevocably his to protect. If you enjoyed this story of a gentle soul, finding her worth in the arms of a silent giant, please like and subscribe to Cowboy Steelheart. Your support allows us to keep bringing you these tales of frontier justice and healing. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the help of AI tools and has been carefully edited by us. All rights reserved.